Reflections, The Nature of Virtuality, Part 1. Excerpts from Virtual Reality Church, Pitfalls and Possibilities, by Darrel, Bock, and Jonathan J. Armstrong. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? T.S. Elliot. Technology is a gift of God. After the gift of life, it is perhaps the greatest of God's gifts. It is the mother of civilizations, of arts, and of sciences. Freeman Dyson. If we are to be skilled ministers of the gospel in the virtual age, then we need to have a thoroughgoing grasp of the nature of virtual reality. What is virtuality? The dictionary defines virtuality as the state of being virtual, or being one way in power, force, or effect, but another way in actuality. Attempting to ferret out the exact nature of virtual reality therefore would seem to be a nearly impossible task. But everything in God's universe has a nature. Every new technology operates by a set of principles, and we will deploy this technology best when we understand these principles and reflect on their relation to the types of problems that we intend to solve by applying them. We have heard a lot about the limitless possibilities of VR in recent years. Ernest Cline, author of the 2011 novel Ready Player One, the film adaptation produced by Steven Spielberg appeared in 2018, explains that he wrote the book because he wanted to explore the technology's limitless application. In the hype that has poured out from the VR industry over the past couple of years, there has been no shortage of claims that essentially everything is within the reach of VR. But every new technology has its limitations, and VR is no exception. When a new technology first lands in the awareness of the public, it may seem that the technology has no bounds. But sustained experience with the new technology and reflection on this experience will reveal its limits. And understanding these limits will allow us to begin setting the technology to its best use. When we as church leaders and Christian educators are first introduced to VR, we may falsely assume that the technology is capable of absolutely everything, including replicating a church service or a seminary-level theology class down to the minutest detail. But this is not the case. VR may be the most powerful communication medium yet invented by humankind, but it will nonetheless require great creativity, patience, wisdom, and expertise to develop effective forms of Christian ministry in VR. In a way, the applications of new technology are indeed limitless, but this does not mean that the technologies themselves do not have limits. Let me explain. If any invention ever stirred the imagination of humanity to dream about limitless possibilities, it would be the book. The book superseded the scroll as the medium of choice for written materials not long after the close of the 1st century AD. Today, hundreds of thousands of new book titles are published each year, and yet we come no closer to exhausting the value of books. If any invention ever offered limitless possibilities, surely it would be the book.
Reading books is a very cheap way to, entertain. I wouldn't call it entertainment because my brain is far too advanced. I'm too smart to read. I'm not gonna sit there and go, smart people read. No, I need action. I need constant chaos in my life to feel content. I need to be driving a supercar and fucking fighting, fucking a bunch of hoes and champagne and going crazy. I can't just sit there, and the pirate on the boat. Like, it's for people with slow brains.
But seen from another angle, books are not limitless but bound, and it is precisely this boundedness that creates the value for which we use books. Even after many centuries, the basic look and feel of books has remained remarkably static, from the time of Julius Caesar to our own day. Even after centuries of improvements and technological advances, books continue to be burdensome to carry, except a few at a time, are susceptible to water and fire damage, and still consume significant amounts of paper, a resource that we today understand to be more precious than ever. The invention of the book has opened up limitless possibilities, but these possibilities are directed and shaped by a very specific set of limitations. Before we dive into the principles of this video, 2 quick caveats are in order. First, while the authors believe that VR technology does carry basic limitations, They admit that distilling precisely what these limitations are is a process that is far more simply done in hindsight than with foresight. When VR technology is understood better in the future, experts will no doubt be able to state VR's fundamental capacities in a fewer number of principles than mentioned in this video. Part 1 of this video series will focus on the first half of the 10 principles discussed by the authors. Second, for each of the principles, the viewer can silently append the phrase, "for the foreseeable future." It should be stated explicitly that all of the conclusions are extrapolations from the constellation of technologies that are known currently as virtual reality. Users will remain aware that VR experiences are simulations of actual reality. Therefore, the value of VR technology will be that it allows users to engage in simulations of experiences that in actual reality could be unsafe, expensive, or impossible. In its present incarnation, VR is a series of wearable apparatuses that simulate sense perception. The VR headsets of today deal with the senses of sight and sound, but there are consumer products available that simulate the sense of touch. These so-called haptic devices can take on a variety of forms, for example, gloves that one can wear in order to touch virtual building blocks, or vests that one can wear in order to feel simulations of physical objects, such as rain, or abstract phenomena, such as music. Haptic devices are currently not as common as VR headsets, but the technology is showing promise, and experts anticipate that select haptic devices will become widely accessible in the years ahead. The technology to simulate the senses of smell and taste is in development in laboratories, but it is not clear at present whether consumer VR will deal with smell and taste within the decade. However, it is clear that VR systems in the future will provide simulations of sense perception of an increasing realism and across a broadening spectrum of senses. The experiences that VR systems will become capable of delivering will become progressively more immersive. One of the controversial questions in the VR industry today is whether the technology will ever become so compelling that the simulations will be indistinguishable from actual reality. Will the sense of presence that VR delivers ever be so powerful that it renders users incapable of detecting whether they are in a simulation? The authors and I share a common perspective. The answer to this question is clearly no. The plotline of many dystopian science fiction films and novels hinges on the idea that VR simulations become so good that they are indistinguishable from the real world. This lost ability to differentiate between virtual reality and actual reality is then exploited by the villains of the movie or book. Not all experts agree, and some enthusiasts seem to think that VR's value cannot be realized unless the technology reaches this point, but we are quite convinced that it is extremely improbable that VR will ever be able to replicate reality so compellingly that users are incapable of distinguishing the simulations from actual reality. This is not to say that people will not use VR for escapism or to block out their experience of actual reality, which to them seems too painful or too banal to face. But the basic fact that users will remain psychologically capable of perceiving that their experiences in VR are simulations means that most VR users will be content to engage in VR for a specific set of uses. These use cases include simulations of experiences that in actual reality would be unsafe, expensive, or impossible. But what will happen as VR technology becomes more advanced? The authors conclude that people will still be able to distinguish the difference between VR and actual reality. From the authors' experience with current VR technology, they see no clues pointing to the conclusion that VR will someday be indistinguishable from actual reality. VR theoretically allows us to experience simulations of anything, but because we will remain aware of the fact that our VR experiences are simulations of reality, we will choose to access VR to facilitate basically only three kinds of experiences: those that in actual reality are potentially unsafe, expensive, or impossible. Many of our everyday experiences in real life would feel like agonizing wastes of time in VR, for example, emptying out the recycling bin. However, we might expect a lot of people to queue up if we were offering VR experiences that in real life were potentially unsafe. For example, driving a sports car down the winding streets of Monaco. Expensive. For example, hosting an evening with friends on your own private super yacht. Or impossible. For example, walking alongside a brontosaurus in a prehistoric habitat. VR experiences that contain value to users will present elements from at least one of these three categories, and sometimes elements from all three. Scuba diving with blue whales or learning to perform open heart surgery could qualify for all three criteria. How then might we apply VR technology for ministry purposes? Let's work through these three categories one at a time. Are there activities that the church and institutions of Christian education engage in on an ongoing basis that are potentially unsafe? Training for missionary aviators comes immediately to mind for the authors. Learning to land an airplane on an airstrip in the jungle is a process that can be improved by VR simulations. What about first aid training or intruder response training for church staff and volunteers? Medical schools are among the earliest educational institutions to adopt VR broadly, and VR simulations offer benefits over traditional techniques when teaching many medical procedures. Those training for missionary service in the medical field may be the first Christian workers for whom VR is a normal part of their educational experience. VR experiences create value when simulating experiences that are perceived to be potentially unsafe in real life. But what is perceived as potentially unsafe will vary for different people and need not pose an objective threat of bodily harm. VR experiences can create value in simulating experiences that are perceived as psychologically unsafe or merely notably uncomfortable. Studies are emerging that demonstrate that VR can be used as an effective tool in overcoming anxiety in an array of situations. Joanne DeFede, professor of psychology at the Medical School of Cornell University, became internationally famous for her work in applying VR to the treatment of patients suffering from PTSD following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
Mental health problems are based in the brain. The problem is most people discriminate against their brain. We wouldn't try and fix our own hearts, but somehow or other we think we can fix our brains.
There are many possible ways in which VR simulations could be applied to reinforce the effectiveness of Christian counseling. Lastly, are there experiences that are impossible in actual reality, but could be simulated in VR for the purposes of deepening spiritual life? The authors suspect that there are, and they suspect that this is where VR will ultimately produce its most significant contributions.
That we are talking about being immersed in God's love. When you go underwater, that symbolizes your spiritual cells are soaking in divine love and new life and forgiveness and release of the old. And so I think that's a beautiful symbolic thing that represents. And it also represents dying to the old self. So just as Jesus was dead and he was buried and he rose again, when you are lowered into the water, that symbolizes that you're dying to the old Drumsy, the old attitudes and the old things that have held you back. And maybe there's guilt and regret and failure, and that stuff is dying. So Drumsy, if you don't mind lowering yourself into the water, and I want to talk about what that happens. So Drumsy, you're fully immersed in the water and you can stay there for a minute. And right now what this is happening is you're immersing yourself in divine love. God's love is all around you. You are a child of God, and that all your mistakes and all your failures and all your regrets, those things are in the past. And so Drumsy, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son.
First, as an abstract example of such an impossible experience, VR could provide a new liturgical language for the global church. The experience of worshiping with Christians from other places in the world is often a powerful source of spiritual renewal in our own lives. Perhaps you have experienced the invigoration of dancing in praise with African Christians in a remote village. Perhaps you have knelt on the floor of a house church in Shanghai and prayed fervently in a circle with Chinese believers from the underground church. Perhaps you have awakened in Europe on a Sunday morning and followed the sound of church bells into a cathedral, discovering God amid the majestic organ music and serene order of service in a way that you did not expect. In these moments, we discover echoes of God's cosmic plan to draw every tongue, tribe, and nation to his eternal throne in never-ceasing worship and adoration. See Revelation 7:9. Many streams of Christian worship find their source in the quest to recreate this heavenly scene, as our liturgical practices seek to resonate with the worship of the saints in God's presence. Could VR provide the new alphabet and musical notation by which we sing praise to God, the new cathedral in which we worship as the global church? What could this impossible experience possibly look like when performed in reality? Maybe for the immediate future, all that we should hope for is the opportunity to visit churches from around the world in VR. If VR technology is never able to compete with the intimacy, vividness, and memorability of real life, then the value of VR experiences will remain confined to activities that in the real world would be potentially unsafe, expensive, or impossible. VR will be an amazing place to explore, but a poor place to live. People will want to visit a reconstruction of first-century Jerusalem in VR, but they will also want to be able to take off the goggles and share their excitement and learning with family and friends over a real plate of falafel. In VR, the user is not a spectator but a participant. Unlike traditional theater and film, which position the user as a spectator of an external performance, VR places the user within the scene. The user of a VR experience therefore assumes himself or herself not to be a passive viewer, but an active participant. This shift in perspective and role renders VR a remarkably powerful medium for shaping attitudes and creating empathy. Theater and film critics sometimes speak of the fourth wall. This phrase refers to the convention that, although spectators can see into the world portrayed by the actors pretend that the spectators are not there. The traditional theater stage can be conceived as a box with 3 closed walls and 1 open wall, through which the audience peers. This has been the basic setup of theater stages even as far back in the Western tradition as the 6th century BC, when ancient Greek actors performed at the Theater of Dionysius on the slopes of the Acropolis in Athens. But in VR, the convention of the fourth wall feels unnatural and constrictive. When you strap on a VR headset, you expect not to be an observer of a performance from the other side of the room, but to be an active participant in what is going on all around you. Audiences in traditional stage and film theaters are spectators who are not asked to do anything, but not to interrupt the performance. Users of VR experiences will instinctively expect to be able to shape the outcome of the experience. Chris Milk, a pioneer in VR cinematography, addressed how the absence of the fourth wall renders VR productions different from traditional theater and film. In a 2015 TED Talk titled, "How Virtual Reality Can Create the Ultimate Empathy Machine," Milk noted,
So film, it's this incredible medium, but essentially it's the same now as it was then. It's a group of rectangles that are played in a sequence.
Milk explained that film has remained for the past century a window through which viewers looked into another world, but VR allows users to step through that window. The act of stepping through the window, passing through the fourth wall that has kept the audience divided from the story of which they are spectators, creates an emotional connection to the story that is not possible in traditional theater or film. Milk tested his theory in his critically acclaimed short film, Clouds over Sidra. This film of 8 minutes and 35 seconds was shot at the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, which is occupied primarily by refugees from Syria. The film is narrated by a 12-year-old girl, Sidra, who guides you on a tour of her life in the refugee camp. For a few minutes, the fact that Syrian refugees face dire circumstances and extreme deprivation is not a distant fact but your own reality. The stories we experience in VR become our own stories because in a way we embody them and actually live them. VR is a new medium with exciting new possibilities, but learning to use any new medium effectively requires a process of trial and error. Jeremy Bailenson reminds us, people using a new medium have a difficult time breaking out of the thinking involved with the previous ones. We see this in the history of Hollywood filmmaking. Many of the early storytellers in Hollywood came from the world of the stage. Consequently, early directors essentially filmed stage shows. One camera angle in front of a proscenium arch, with few to no cuts. The pivot from spectator to participant represents one of the greatest challenges posed to producers of VR content, including producers who seek to create VR for the purposes of Christian ministry. Just as Hollywood filmmakers initially reproduced stage shows in the new medium of film, so our first inclination may be to reproduce the form of church services as we now know them in VR. But this will probably prove to be a misstep. Each element from our church services today will require careful translation into the medium of VR in order to express the spiritual purpose of each element properly. VR simulates sense experience but cannot directly present abstract concepts. VR excels at articulating spatial relationships and physical movement. VR is an extraordinarily effective platform for visualizing data that can be sequenced by spatial relationships, such as models of complex structures or intricate maneuvers. VR simulates sense experience, but cannot directly present abstract concepts or spiritual realities. If you were attempting to teach me about something complicated but concrete, let's say how the components of a Boeing 747 airplane are assembled, a well-constructed VR experience could be a tremendous aid. It is relatively straightforward to imagine how VR could significantly improve the process of learning about this complicated but concrete process. You could set out in VR a series of jumbo jets in various stages of completion, and reviewing these models would provide me with a clear sense of each step involved in the process. Setting up this visual aid in VR rather than in real life would also come with the advantage of not requiring hundreds of millions of dollars of inventory and showroom space. For some learning experiences, VR offers incredible resources, but VR does not improve our capacity to learn and communicate about everything. While VR is a powerful tool to help us imagine spatial relationships and the manipulation of physical objects, the medium is uncannily concrete. If you were teaching a Bible lesson on the story of David and Goliath, for example, you could use VR to pinpoint on the map where the confrontation took place. You could use VR to allow your audience to see from all directions a digital replica of an ancient Israelite sling, and VR modeling could help participants understand how such an innocent-looking weapon could propel lethal force. You could create an interactive exhibit that would allow audience members to see exactly how tall Goliath would appear to them if they were standing next to him. VR would excel at communicating all of these concrete realities. But VR could do very little to help you explain the source of David's faith and how the audience can find this faith for themselves. If you wish to note in your Bible lesson that David's motivation for slaying the giant was not for personal glory, but to defend the name of the Lord, it would not be obvious how VR could improve on a simple verbal statement of this point. VR can reproduce digitally realities that we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears, but what about realities that we feel, intuit, and perceive spiritually? This is not to say that standard toolkits will not be developed for VR that facilitate the communication of abstract concepts. Emoticons are an interesting case study in the way that elements that are not native to one form of communication can be transposed into another. Text messaging does not natively communicate information about the emotional state of the author, except when the author explicitly states such information. If you receive a text from a family member that reads, "I'll be there in an hour," you may not have all of the information you need in order to interpret her message. Is the sender expressing excitement that she will see you soon, or disappointment that her train is running late? The smiley face, one of humankind's noblest inventions, has been devised in order to help us in precisely this predicament. The sender of a text can communicate her approximate emotional state by appending an emoticon, that is, a symbol of a specific feeling, represented by a face that is at once recognizable, but not personal, to the words of her message. In spoken language, emotional information is communicated by vocal tone, but because text messages do not reproduce vocal tone, this information is missing unless it is translated into an emoji or expressly stated. It may be that standard toolkits are devised in order to allow ministers and Christian educators to communicate about the abstract concepts of theology and the interior realities of Christian spiritual life. In fact, the Christian tradition already possesses a rich library of symbols and allegories in order to articulate the spiritual truths of the faith. As Christians, we receive the stories of the Old Testament as lessons of faith for us today. See Romans 15:4 and 1 Corinthians 10:11. These stories all point to deep spiritual realities through concrete historical events. Jesus' parables are a treasure trove of specific spiritual symbols that can be applied in teaching Christian doctrine. Even more than this, Jesus becomes for us the master teacher from whom we learn to teach theology through the mundane. The farmer sows the seed, which is the word of God. See Matthew 13:3. A man discovers in a field a pearl of immeasurable value, which is the kingdom of God. See Matthew 13:44. The wise virgins await the entrance of the bridegroom, who is the Son of God. See Matthew 25:1. The sign of Jonah, who was swallowed by a great fish and remained in its belly for 3 days and 3 nights, points to the death and resurrection of the Messiah. See Matthew 12:39. Jesus is the vine, and we are the branches. See John 15:5. This abundant library of symbols, embedded into the Christian tradition at its very foundation, has been an inexhaustible fount of inspiration for Christian artists of all ages. It is waiting to be exposited compellingly, beautifully, and faithfully in virtual reality. VR by itself cannot overcome the spiritual blindness about which Jesus warned when he said to the audience of his own parables, "You will indeed hear but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive." Matthew 13-14. The telephone has turned out to be a useful tool for the purposes of Christian ministry. Most pastors use them every day. But despite frequent jokes to the contrary, there are no direct phone lines to heaven to allow us to hear the voice of God through our telephones. The same will prove true with virtual reality. VR will be a useful tool for Christian ministry, but bringing spiritual sight has always been, and will remain, the work of the Spirit. As we labor as Christian teachers to bring into visible form the spiritual realities of the faith, we trust that God will illumine our minds and increase our love for Himself. VR is an immersive media experience, which means that the attention of users is so focused on the sights and sounds of the VR content that they frequently become unaware of the people and activities around them. In order to ensure the physical safety of the user, VR experiences will need to be proctored in controlled environments. VR's power is presence, but to be present in VR is to be functionally absent in one's physical location. At least concerning the current generation of VR headsets, when one is present in VR, one cannot see one's actual physical surroundings. Augmented reality, or AR, aspires to merge our experience of the physical with the digital, and it is probable that commercially successful AR products will become available in the next several years. But, at least concerning VR experiences as we know them today, you are going to want to check yourself in before stepping into virtual reality. When you place the headset over your face, your expressions become masked, and your interactions with the invisible personalities and artifacts all around you can feel absurd or even disturbing to those nearby. In its current state, VR is best experienced in carefully controlled spaces where you are free to disregard your physical environment for a few moments. It is not a media experience that people will want to step in and out of quickly. In the world we know today, there are certain activities which people are willing to check themselves in for, in order to see a film at a movie theater, for example. we check ourselves in at the airport in order to fly across the ocean, or at a restaurant for an elegant dinner. For these activities, we are willing to commit our physical presence for a set period of time. It is worth noting that people also check themselves into church, sometimes literally, as is the case with many nursery programs. Churchgoers are familiar with the embarrassment of having to get up in the middle of a service and leave for one unexpected reason or another. The commitment of time and effort that we invest in preparing to attend church services is not entirely unlike the steps prerequisite to attending appointments in VR. Churchgoers know the Sunday morning routine of dressing in church clothes, eating breakfast more or less punctually, and then driving across town to attend church services. Appointments in VR require a different setup routine, but nonetheless, some preparation is in order to ensure that the experience is as successful as possible. This concludes part 1 of this series. Part 2 of this video series will focus on the remaining principles, further exploring the consequences and nature of virtuality as outlined by the authors. I hope you will join me the next time. Until then, I pray that the Lord would bless and keep you, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus.